Life, even in this crazy, self-seeking world, revolves around love and relationships. Most of the popular songs are about love relationships that bring either great joy or great heartache. The plots of the best novels and the greatest movies are all about the search for love and the hunger for belonging to a community. Our day-to-day relationships tell us the same thing. In every culture and in every time period, it's in relationships where people experience their greatest joy, and it's in relationships where people experience their deepest pain and worst conflict. And that makes perfect sense because we are created in the image of a God who is perfectly relational by nature. It shouldn't surprise us then that the Bible tells us over and over that it's in our relationships where we glorify God the most, and it's in our relationships where we really prove the genuineness of our faith. In today's reading from Proverbs 26 to 27, we see more and more instructions on how to live in godly wisdom in the way we interact with others. And there are three main categories that I'll point to. Number one, he begins with the idea of how we relate with people that he calls fools. Now in the world, someone who is a fool is someone who is ignorant or stupid or silly. But we need to remember that the Proverbs have a different definition of what it means to be foolish. In the Proverbs, someone who is a fool is simply someone who doesn't walk in God's ways, someone who is self-seeking, someone who is wise in their own eyes. So verses 1 and 8 tell us not to give honor to a fool. And presumably the reason we would do that is to try to gain some kind of advantage for ourselves. He tells us in verses 4 to 5 to be careful in our conversations with foolish people who don't walk with God, because we'll end up being just like them. He says in verses 6 to 10 not to be quick to trust a foolish person with much, because it's dangerous to us and to those around us. Category number 2, he gives us some warnings about what happens when we do not use godly wisdom in the way that we talk with one another. Verse 17, he says that it's dangerous to interfere in other people's affairs, to get involved in issues that have nothing to do with us. Verses 18 to 19, he says you're destroying people's lives when you deceive them, but then you pretend and say, oh, I was just joking. Verse 22, he says the one who whispers gossip has a negative impact that goes deep into a person's heart. He goes on in verse 24 to say that the one who hates or despises his neighbor, but to their face he pretends that he loves him, eventually his deceit will be revealed. He says in verse 28, the person who flatters someone else in order to try to get something from them, eventually will bring himself to ruin. And then he begins chapter 27 warning us against boasting in order to try to get the admiration of other people. That leads us to the third category. In contrast to using our tongues in a selfish and foolish and ungodly way, he gives us some instructions on how to use our tongues to love others, to bless others, to be a true friend to others. He says in verses 5 to 6, it's much better to openly rebuke your friend in love in order to point them to God than it is to withhold love from them by saying nothing when they needed to hear it. Because he says the faithful wounds of a friend, even though they're painful, are life-giving and truthful. But the kisses of an enemy, even though they feel really nice, are deceitful and dangerous. Just like oil and perfume bring a sweet smell to the body, he says in verse 9, the words and loving counsel of a friend bring a sweetness to the heart. Then in verse 17, he says, true friends will walk closely with one another in a way that helps develop godly character. As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. Our choices in relationships can either serve to develop or to diminish godly character in us. And our relationships provide the perfect platform and opportunity to put the love and wisdom and goodness of God on display for everyone around us to see.